In the meantime, a good friend of mine, a general practitioner, said, Al, he said, I'm getting out of this area. I'm going north. He said, I came upon a spot that was, I thought, ideal. It's called Sequim, Washington. He said, why don't you take a look? You may find it much to your liking. So I did. After he had established a practice, and he became busier than ever, but he was the type of person who enjoyed being quite busy. And I thought, why not? The air is clean, and my wife will be away from any curious eyes in her old neighborhood. And so I decided that I'd sold the practice to these two fellas at a minimum cost to them. And I found this old Seventh-day Adventist church. It had just been abandoned in the city of Sequim, one of the main streets. It had a church and behind it a parking lot with an old home. And the church would have been ideal, but separated from the church was from the church proper was the church school, and the school was large enough for a medical practice where we could have 3 or 4 rooms, and it would take a good deal of remodeling, but I'd have one of the people from LA come up and do some architectural work for us. And he did a wonderful job, even put in an artificial silo in keeping with the tone of the city. There was a grain elevator in the city, which was had been a type of signpost for the city, and we constructed this rise that looked like a grain elevator. It was made of wood, so that the building was in keeping with the architecture of the general architecture of the city. The front part, the church, was left unattended for a while until it was converted into a physical therapy facility, and we needed a physical therapist. I needed a physical therapist. The practice, for what it was very little to begin with. We had 4 girls, and if I didn't need four girls, I could get by with 3. But we had an X-ray, and we had a cast room, and we had examining rooms. Examining tables were made by local carpenters. They did a fine job. The roof leaked occasionally, so we had to have that repaired. And my wife had increasing difficulties. Unfortunately, in medical school, Alzheimer's disease was described in our pathology text in 1 paragraph at the bottom of a page. And I knew very little. I had no occasion really to investigate the disease. It wasn't interest to do so before, but Lorraine gradually became more involved. She developed greater difficulty doing those things that she had done without thinking about them, and her behavior became different. It took her to specialists who had done numerous examinations. A PET scan showed a shrinking cortex of the brain, but one of the doctors said, "Oh, that's very little." I think he was trying to save my feeling about the matter, but she became difficult to manage, and I had to dress her and feed her, and there she passed away. Yeah, we put her in a senior rest home, and quite nice facility. It was about 6:30 our time, and I thought, who was calling at this hour? Of course, it could have been an emergency. And she said she had to introduce herself. She said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you." Her husband had been my lab partner when we were medical students, and my roommate when we were interns. Yes, and there's a bit of sadness in her voice, and she said, "Norm passed away." And I said, I was sorry to hear that. But then my wife had passed away also, and I said, "It's rather early in the morning, and I'm not sure I'm fully awake. Do you mind if I call you later in the day?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And I did, and we commiserated. I said, I think I'd like to pay my respects and come and see you." And she said, "Oh, that isn't necessary. My goodness, we're at different ends of the country." I said, "Well, no, I prefer to see you and talk with you about your loss, and perhaps you can bolster my spirits and talk about my loss." Well, we set a date for meeting. It was about a month, and I had my light London fog coat. It was January of the year, and I had forgotten how cold Chicago could be at that time of the year. And we couldn't land, as I recall, so we circled O'Hare for maybe half hour, and finally we landed, and I deplaned, and I saw this attractive woman. She was hidden in a fur coat that went from her head to her ankle, but she recognized me, I think, with some difficulty. She was expecting a 25-year-old, and instead she saw someone who had aged considerably. But we met, and we made plans to see each other, and we became fortunately intimate shortly thereafter, and planned to perhaps live together in Washington. Of course, in all that time, before I left to see her, I called daily, and we talked and reminisced and found out what we liked, what we didn't like. There was very little I didn't like. I had 2 daughters, and Yetta had 2 sons and a daughter, but of course they were adults and living out of the home, except for yours one son, Paul, who lived with you and your mother. And then we finally met. So it was a period of 9 months or 8 months that we communicated by telephone. I was quite eager to have her join me. Living alone in a large home was rather trying. I had to hire help to take care of the home, someone to clean it at least once a week, and then the gardener. And by that time, I had all of my grown-up toys, my automobiles, in the large garage that was built to accommodate them. So I was busy enough, but the evenings were rather challenging because they were lonely. And the practice, the orthopedic practice, was nothing like it had been in California, because the town was small, even though it had drawn people from the surrounding areas. There were still a limited number of patients, and very few in the hospitals. My level of work activity was much smaller than it had been, which wasn't altogether bad since I was about 70 years of age. Well, Yetta keeps reminding me that I told her I was going to marry you. I told her, and she said, "Al, you don't even know me." I said, "I know you well enough from our telephone conversations and from the time that I met you." And of course, she wasn't opposed to that. So, Yetta took over, and I was so very fortunate because she straightened out the mess in the office. There were many unpaid bills, both patients and bills that needed to be paid. But she systematized everything, and things were much smoother after she came in. And of course the house became a home again. And I was grateful, and she was a wonderful cook. Of course she still is. I'm sure she added years to my life. We got along quite well, and one of her endearing traits was that she failed to argue or would not persist in an argument, which was fine. And I figured if she wasn't going to argue, then I wasn't going to give her any cause for argument. So we got along idealistically. We decided to take a vacation to Hawaii, and we left the office. Of course, it remained open with the girls, that is the secretary. But we were gone for, a week or 10 days to Maui, or one of the islands in Hawaii. And Yetta taught me to play golf, and I hit the ball possibly 25 yards, and she clamored in great delight. She said, "Oh, that's wonderful. You're a born golfer." And that started on another adventure of golfing for a number of years. But having been to Hawaii and then traveling to California one winter day on a golfing trek, Yetta and I were so taken with the welcoming warmth of the season. It must have been winter in Washington when we reached the balmy weather in California. And Yetta said, she'd love to live here in California. And I said, it's probably not a bad idea to think about leaving Washington, which was quite nice. The weather in Sequim was unusually good for Washington. The winters were never or seldom severe, and the summers, of course, were wonderfully cool. But it was time to leave, and so we decided that we would make an effort to find a home in Southern California. Of course, we had to sell what we had. I had all the automobiles, wonderful old cars. I think we had about 8 classic cars. There were ready buyers for them. Of course, they didn't give us what we thought they were worth, but that was beside the point. And I wanted to keep my bride happy, and I wanted to keep my bones warm. So we sold off the cars. We had an auctioneer come in and get rid of all of many of our fine antiques and furnishings, and we gave most of the contemporary furniture to the children. And we landed up in Palm Desert and in a country club setting. It was quite nice, as charming as this place. We were living in Palm Desert. There was a senior center. It was advertised, and one of the courses offered was creative writing, which was conducted by a retired professor who taught writing. And I thought we ought to give that a go, because I had enjoyed writing for many years, and we applied to the class. There must have been about 8 or 10 people in the class, and we would be given assignments, and I found that I rather enjoyed writing. Yetta and I would correct each other's papers, and she would type my stories. They were really memoirs to begin with. Teacher, the mentor in the class, found something in my writing that she enjoyed. And she said one day, "Al, why don't you write a book?" And I scoffed. I said, "Write a book? That's almost ridiculous." She said, no, it isn't. She says, "You start. I'll help you as much as I can." The first book was Death, Dear Doctor, and the main character was Dr. Josh Harrington. We self-printed, of course, and we went to bookstores and promoted the book, and but we enjoyed it. I would dictate to Yetta, and she would type the pages, and then we'd correct it. And then one day, when we submitted them, I think, to one club that was interested in e-books, electronic book club in Santa Barbara. The group doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But she was on the computer, and she screamed, "Al," she said, "you won first prize." Oh. Well, before then, I had won a third prize, and then the subsequent second prize. Now this, a gold medal award. That was for what, Farewell My Country? Something like that, yeah. And I was quite pleased. But it was great fun. And actually 10 were published, and I thought they continued to get better. At least I found that writing them became easier. Even I became excited while writing them. I suppose other authors have the same emotional response to their writing. I don't know. Then I found that dictating to Yetta produced some physical disruption in her life. She would develop neck pain, and that meant having conservative treatment, physical therapy, And I thought this really wasn't worth the effort on both our parts. But by that time, I was considerably older. I had always been interested in painting, I think, from the time I was quite young. And I think I mentioned that at age 5 or 6, I painted a home on a frosted window, and it was three-dimensional. And my dad, seeing it, exclaimed to my mother, "Look, Molly, look what Al did." But I had always had an interest in painting and the work of the known artists. But of course, all that had to remain in the background while I was preparing for my profession. But even when I was a young doctor, I would draw the anatomical parts of the patient that I was focused on, so that when the patient had a painful back, I would paint the torso and indicate the area of involvement. Then we took courses in watercolor painting, and I was introduced to acrylic painting here at Maravilla. That was about, 4 or 5 years ago. The teacher there, I was blessed with good teachers. She incidentally had the same name as my high school painting teacher. Eberhardt was her name, and she was very engaging, complimentary, and she said, "Al, you're doing very well." And she gave me some pointers, and from that time on, I think I've been painting. And now, of course, our walls are covered with my masterpieces. Yes, what happened was that Palm Desert, being in the valley, became almost, uninhabitable for 3 months of the year. It was really a desert, and the temperatures would climb to 110, 120. So we couldn't play golf, and besides, the golf courses were renovated in, I think, October. So for a number of months, first the heat and then the renovation, kept us from playing golf. And we thought, since we found it difficult to leave the home during those torrid months, we left and went to the coast and rented an apartment for a couple months each year for several years. And then we thought, this is kind of ridiculous. Why don't we find a place where the temperature is much more comfortable year-round? So we looked along the coast and made a number of inquiries, and we found Maravilla that way. This is where we wound up, and we haven't been sorry.